On today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast, our burning questions for every team in the West starts with, is it time for Anaheim to make a leap?
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are your daily NHL podcast, and we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we start our burning questions for every team in the Western Conference, talking Anaheim, Calgary, and Chicago here today. A few teams with young talent, or in the case of the Flames, trying to figure it out. So we'll talk about those three teams and some of the biggest things leading up to the season that still need to be answered. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wilds, and one half of the Western Conference Tuesday dynamic duo, joined as always by JD Young of Locked On Sharks. And JD, we have timed this out perfectly to run every week until the season starts. All 16 teams. Going to go through and some of the biggest questions, and so we'll start from the top of the list, and we'll lead you all the way up to the season with what you should know and what needs to be answered about every team in the West, including our first team here today, the Anaheim Ducks, who had a pretty notably quiet offseason, like very, very quiet offseason. And so for the Anaheim Ducks, I think the way to kind of get this going is like, what's the goal? What's the objective this year? What are they trying to do for this upcoming season other than just simply like exist? Like, is this a year where they want to see the team, take a step? Like, are you still cultivating young talent? Like, what's the goal? It's the Office Space quote. What would you say you do here?
Other than swap out jerseys, I mean, what else could you tell me that Anaheim did this offseason? So, I think that's the burning question: is what is this team trying to do, right? And this team has drafted high for the past several seasons and has amassed a lot of talent that's kind of graduated into NHL players now. And you expect this team to kind of go from this rebuilding team to that fun, frisky, young core team, and like where you can see the pieces of it going forward. But it was interesting that you look at other teams in the division, or like at these other teams kind of in the same spot, like San Jose Sharks, Chicago, where they went out and they added veteran players who kind of put around their young pieces to kind of help these guys go along. Anaheim was just like, we're cool, bro. We're just going to kind of go with what we have and see what goes on here. And they do have some veteran guys, like you have a Frank Petrano, you have, an Alex Killorn, you have like a Ryan Strome, and maybe you just expect like these guys, like let's another year in the system. Let's kind of see how things progress here. But this team has like a ton of cap space, a lot of young players, and it feels like they've been rebuilding forever. This feels like it should be the year where they're at least competitive throughout the season, and maybe, not make a wild card spot, but can you at least like compete until, the All-Star break, or can you compete until the trade deadline?
Yeah, that's the big thing at the end of the day for me is like, I think of Arizona from last year where they, like you said, they were competitive through the first half of the season, kind of tailed off at the end. And, you look at all the other teams, like it seems like all the other teams that are not in a postseason spot are doing something to kind of push themselves forward. Like obviously for Chicago, it was what does it look like with Connor Bedard, getting acclimated to the NHL level? And it's fair to say he hit the ground running. And so then, as we'll talk about with Chicago to end the show today, you build off of that with the San Jose Sharks, like continuing to accumulate young talent and build that core group going forward. Like easy to point out. It's like Anaheim just, they have pieces, they have players, but it just seems like every year they go into the year and it just is the same results. And, you've got this group, you've got young players that you're building around, but at some point you got to start putting wins together. Like it feels like they are longer into the process than either San Jose or Chicago or even Utah. It feels like they're further into the process, but also at the same time further behind, which is, that's not a spot you want to be. And so, they just have to continue to try to, build a group and win some games. It may not be the biggest question, but one that I'm really keeping an eye on this year for this team is what happens with John Gibson. Like, he's still on the roster. There was heavy flirtation with moving him. Detroit was, looking into it pretty heavily this offseason. Nothing ended up coming of it, but it was rumored at the trade deadline this past season. He's 30 years old. You've got Lucas Dostal, who is expected to be kind of that next goalie for this group.
Yep.
And I know he's been a mainstay for the Ducks since he came into the league, but does he want to just continue to be part of this mix? And, at some point you'd think you'd want to get a little taste of some postseason action and, go to a team that has a chance to bring a cup home. Because if you look at his numbers too, like they had
they were bad last year.
Yeah,
they're bad.
They're not good numbers by any. He had the one postseason, in which they've been to the playoffs. The Ducks have 4 times with Gibson on the roster, but none since 2017, 2018. And in all but one of those seasons, they were done in the first round. Like 2016, 2017, they made a little bit of a run, obviously, but no playoffs since then. Like at some point you kind of, you got to scratch that itch, right? Like to get back into the postseason and give yourself a chance for a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, I mean, his numbers last year were like below Mackenzie Blackwood, and he gets paid way more than Mackenzie Blackwood does. And I know, again, that team, the Ducks were not a good team last year. And I know they dealt with a lot of injuries last season as well. Leo Carlson missed some time. You have Trevor Zegras who missed some time last year. But like, what is this team going to do here? And, even a guy like Trevor Zegras, who kind of feels like maybe he's not part of the solution, is he eventually going to get traded? And it feels like you're almost cycling out of the guys you originally drafted to be part of your next core. And now it's just, when is this Ducks team going to do something? And I think that's the most frustrating thing from them is because, again, they have a really talented pool of players, but it's just like, it feels like it's like the Titanic trying to hit that, like trying to steer out of the way of the avalanche, where it's just so slow. And I know they want to try to do this the right way, but at some point you got to like tap the gas here and try to do something and try to be a competitive team. So yeah, I'm curious to see, is this the year if they can actually kind of take that step, or are they just going to do what they've always done and just kind of be one of the 3 worst teams in the NHL and trade off pieces at the trade deadline? And does that include Gibson and Trevor Zegras this season? So yeah, they're very much one of those teams where you could tell me like that they're, fun, frisky team and, have some, kind of play meaningful games, or that they're the same old Ducks. And it feels like it's either or, and that's it. So,
and at some point there's going to be a question as to whether or not Pat Verbeek is doing enough to like move it forward. Like that's the thing with GMs too, is when you kind of go through this rebuilding process and trying to re-identify like the new core moving forward, you allow yourself a certain amount of leeway, but after a while it's like, have we progressed? Have we moved at all? Have we moved ourselves forward even a little bit? And at this point, if you're shaking the magic 8 ball, it's looking like you're getting all signs point to no.
Yeah.
So we'll see, but it is really like, it's concerning too, coming off of just as quiet of an offseason as they had. Like, you'd think the teams that are near the bottom are compelled to do the most to try to improve. Did not. That is not the case. So the Ducks are hibernating, I guess. Do Ducks hibernate? They fly south for the winter.
Yeah. So or the summer, I guess.
These Ducks are just hanging out, I guess.
Who knows where these Ducks are flying?
Well, it goes from a team that we just really don't know to a team that we kind of expect will see what should happen this upcoming season in the Calgary Flames, who are definitely in transition themselves. So we'll take a look at the burning questions for the Calgary Flames as we continue today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, now we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with the YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On NHL. Once again, we are your daily NHL podcast, and we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. All right, let's talk Calgary Flames here today, as it's a team that roster needs some work.
Yes.
But as we talked about like a month ago, there are a lot of pieces on that Calgary roster that are pretty entrenched.
Yeah.
Due to contract status. And so the interesting question for this Calgary Flames team is like, is this the year that they finally bottom out? Like, is this where we see this is where you then clean everything up and you start fresh? Like, you've still got Nazem Kadri, you've got Jonathan Huberdeau, but no more Jacob Markstrom. So the goaltending is going to be a fresh group and a young group. Do we see the forwards and defensemen follow suit?
Yeah, I think that's the big question. And I talked with Jess, who is a host of Locked On Flames, and last week for her show. And I think that's the hope, at least from Jess's perspective, is that like this team can pick a direction, right? And it feels like they're trying to be that team that maybe successfully navigates the retool. But it's just so hard to actually pull that off, right? You look at the All-Stars, who I think actually successfully navigated the retool because they were able to draft insanely well at the back end of the first round. But for the Flames, I think this is a team that really needs to look long and hard at kind of who their core pieces are going to be going forward. And if that's going to be able to compete in what's going to be a very competitive Pacific Division here soon. And I just don't think they have the horses right now to kind of be those guys. And, like you mentioned, you have, Huberdeau, who's not going anywhere because of that contract. And maybe Kadri, you could potentially move somewhere, if you wanted to retain. I think the Flames still have the retain slots, but like, it's just it feels like a team that is got a lot of older players and not a lot of exciting young guys coming up here in the near future. And you just kind of it feels like they kind of hit their peak, with that Gaudreau RIP, with that Game 7 win, against the Stars. And that was kind of the peak of everything. And ever since that moment, it's just been downhill. And this team just hasn't been able to kind of accept what this team actually is now.
7 players who are 30 or older. You've got Huberdeau, who's 31. He's signed through 2031. Nazem Kadri's 33, Blake Coleman 32, Mikhail Backlund is 35, Kevin Rooney 31, and then on defense you've got Mackenzie Weegar who's 30. He's also signed through 2031, and he's got a full no trade. Just throwing that out there. Then Joel Hanley is 33. So, like you said, it's a lot of older players.
And locked up for a long time, too. It's not like you can just be like, oh, let's just get rid of these. Like, no, these guys are not going anywhere unless you're aggressive about it.
You have 4 players who are locked into 2029 or later. Oof. One of them is Igor Sharangovich, who is 26. But the rest are Kadri, Huberdeau, and Weegar. And all of them... Actually, Kadri has a no movement clause for the next 2 years, and then it goes to a modified no trade. Huberdeau has a full no movement clause throughout the duration of the whole thing. That's a problem. That's something that's going to have to be addressed at some point because and the funny thing too is even considering those contracts, they still have $19 million in cap space. So you are in position to be able to take on a bad contract in return if you move one of those guys out, if anybody even wants to take them on.
Or maybe they just go like the Nashville route where we're just like, screw it, we got a bunch of old guys, let's just sign some old guys and try to make a run now. Because like they have pieces, right? Like what if that's just their thing. It's like, we have pieces. Maybe we think Huberdeau bounces back. Maybe if we get another dude in that can kind of maybe make Huberdeau where he doesn't have to be the guy, maybe he can be like the second banana type of player. And we go out and try to find somebody, right? We got a new building that we're building here. Like, I don't know, like just pick a direction. Like, what are you? Are you just going to just kind of float along and be this team? Are you going to bottom out? Or are you going to, be like Nashville and just be super aggressive and just go sign a bunch of guys and be like, we'll figure it out in the future when everybody is just like 50,000 years old and their contracts are on the books until the sun explodes. So
just pick
a direction.
Go give Leon Draisaitl $13 million.
All the money. Oh man, that would be fun. That would be spicy. Man.
Edmonton fans would be livid if that happens. But
man, now I want that to happen. Like Draisaitl being the guy, you have like the Battle of Alberta would just be off the charts every time. Yeah. Like with like McDavid versus Draisaitl, Hubert. Oh man, now I want that. Seth, you've planted that in my head. Now that's all I want.
I've spoken it into existence. Let's make it happen.
When he does go to out, you'd be like, Seth called it first. Old Rusty called it first.
Just one other thing that I am intrigued by for this Flames team this year is just how the goalie situation plays out. Now you've got Dan Vladar, you've got Dustin Wolf. What does the split look like? Because no longer do you have Jacob Markstrom who can give you 50, 60 starts when he's healthy. This is a good opportunity for Dustin Wolf to step in and take the job. But I would imagine they'll lean on Dan Vladar at least to start, and we'll see how things go from there.
Yeah, I'm curious too. Then you also have Devin Cooley in the mix, who I think is like a really nice third back, kind of third goalie. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Dan Vladar maybe does start, but he only played 20 games last year, even after he's not a guy who's played a ton of games. He's played 27 games in the 22-23 season. And yes, they had Markstrom there, But like, can he be a guy who can play 35, 40 games in a season? That I think remains to be seen from him. So yeah, how this goaltending shakes out, and do you want to put Dustin Wolf, a young goalie? Yes, he's played a ton of games in the AHL, but kind of playing that NHL grind now of wanting him to start 40 games in a season. That's a big jump from where he's been previously. So.
Well, speaking of a team looking to take a big jump, we'll talk about year 2 of the Connor Bedard tenure for Chicago. Did they add enough to help out Bedard in his sophomore season? We'll discuss that and more Chicago questions as we finish today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. One final segment of today's episode of Locked On NHL. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. We are your team each and every day. And make sure for your second listen today, you check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. We're getting close to the start of the NHL season, which means it's fantasy draft time. And if you want to be fully ready to go to make your picks and win your league, Locked On Fantasy Hockey has you covered. All right, let's talk Chicago for our final segment of today's burning questions. The first of a 5-part series, 5+ part series, just breaking down burning questions for each team in the West. We turn to the Chicago Blackhawks. Connor Bedard's rookie season, albeit with some injuries, was a pretty good success. He was the Calder Trophy winner, and now the question:
does that hurt for you to say? Sorry, the eye roll.
Yeah, I was gonna just move right past it, but now we get to sit in it for a little bit.
Get to waft in that. Anyway, sorry.
Should not have been, but that's another show. In fact, I think we did a few of those. Now it becomes like building around Bedard, adding more talent to the talent pool, adding more to the roster. And for Chicago, they added Tyler Bertuzzi, they added Pat Maroon. They've got young skill players like Lucas Reichel, Kevin Korchinski, pieces like that. Did Chicago do enough this offseason to help maximize Connor Bedard's skill set going into his second season?
Yeah, I think also, the big piece is Taylor Hall, who they acquired last off season, and missed basically the entire season because of an injury. So it's almost like a free agent acquisition that's, you've had on your team this whole time. So I do think we see that big superstar jump from Bedard this season, right? I know it's different players, but right, you look at Connor McDavid, his first season, 48 points in 45 games. That next season, 30 goals, 70 assists, 100 points in 82 games. And I fully expect Bedard to be a triple-digit point producer this year, especially if Bertuzzi and Taylor Hall are, if Taylor Hall can continue to be the guy that he was and is coming back from his injury, and Bertuzzi, who I think is, definitely adds some grit as well as skill to this team, and you see these young defensemen continue to grow in their roles. I expect Connor Bedard, maybe I don't expect them to be the worst offense that they were in the NHL last year. And I expect Bedard to be a big part of the reason why they, maybe move from the worst to like a meh offense instead of the worst team in the NHL when it comes to scoring points. So yeah, I think Bedard's ready to have this just monster season, and everyone sees why he was a generational talent.
Well, that's the thing too, is, you don't need to make like a huge jump. You just need to get a little closer to everybody else. Because if we look at the goals scored this past season, you've got Toronto leading the East with 303, Colorado leading the West with 304. Chicago had 179 goals on the season. And so you think about how far away they are from the top team, but beyond San Jose, those are the only two teams to score under 200 goals in the Western Conference. And so you need to add, even to get to the teams that were in contention, like for playoff spots, now you're talking all the way up to like 250, because Los Angeles Kings, Calgary Flames, Arizona, now Utah, and the Minnesota Wild and Winnipeg, those are all teams that were either in postseason spots or in contention for them, that were all in the 250 goal range. So you essentially have to add 100 goals to get yourself into like legit contender. You're not going to get that all in one season.
Yeah.
So just get yourself above 200. Get yourself above 200 into that maybe 210 range. And then all of a sudden, like you said, you go from absolute last place to where maybe you are closer to 20 than you are to 32. And that's how you take a jump with a young player, is just climb one step this year, and we'll consider that progress. And like we talked about with Anaheim, like you look at all these other teams in the bottom part of the standings, it just feels like they're all starting to stack those steps together. And Anaheim is waiting in the lobby for the elevator, but the elevator's out of order, and they're just sitting there waiting like, well, at some point it'll be here, but it never shows up.
Yeah, but I think the pieces they add, right? Like they added Taylor Hall, has been kind of in his prime, he was, a 30 to 40 goal scorer, but like I think for him being like a 20 goal scorer sounds about right. Bertuzzi scored 20 goals last season, 21 goals in 80 games for the Leafs. Teravainen, 25 goals last year for Carolina. And yes, these guys are going to be playing on the same teams, but you expect them to have a bigger role on this Chicago team. So maybe they won't be as efficient as they were, but I think just, again, you're adding potentially 60 goals right there in 3 players. And that could be a huge addition. Again, just can you go from like the worst to just like a mediocre team? And then with Connor Bedard's natural progression, I think this team is ready to kind of, again, just start to enter that fun, frisky team. And then like next season, can you start to maybe talk about like, okay, can you be one of those teams who's in it at least until the playoffs, or can you, or till the trade deadline? Can you be one of those type of teams? So I think that's kind of the natural progression for them. So,
the unfortunate one, and you talked about this with Jack, I think you broke it while you guys were doing a crossover episode, was the Laurent Brossoit injury, where he's going to miss pretty much the entirety of training camp in the preseason, had knee surgery. Because you look at goals allowed, and the Blackhawks allowed the third most in the entire Western Conference. That's another area that they could look to improve upon. And the funny thing too is you look statistically last year, and Chicago goalies were like league average. Yeah. So it's not like the goalies got torched terribly, but adding a guy like Brossoit to the mix, he's been a very serviceable to good backup over the course of his career. Played with Connor Hellebuyck for a while. Losing out on that early in the season, that's tough. But that's another move that they made, another addition that they made to just try to help kind of continue to propel them up the stairs.
Yeah, and I think for them, it's just more of like, can you just play in your offensive zone for more than, where it's not just Bedard having to go out there and do stuff and create, and then all of a sudden you spend the next 3 shifts in your own zone, and then Bedard gets back out there and he has to try to kind of work things. Yeah. So that's where hopefully you can build a little bit more in that situation. So, I mean, as a Sharks fan, I watched a lot of that last year of just like stuck in your own zone throughout the entire time. So, you look at like Chicago was one of the worst teams. They were actually below San Jose when it came to shot at or Corsi for. So they were basically every shot attempt, they had 43.71% of the shot attempts. So they're just getting hammered with shots night in, night out at 5v5. And if you're below San Jose in anything after last year, it's usually not very good indicator for you. So yeah, I expect them. They got some more veterans. I expect that Corsi forward to kind of go up. I expect them to be able to kind of control the pace of play a little bit more, maybe not rely on the rush as much and not kind of be like a one attack offense, be able to sustain pressure. And I think you're going to see Bedard be a big winner of that, especially with these the acquisitions and Taylor Hall's return. I expect them to just be a more fun, competitive team night in, night out.
We will continue to keep an eye on these teams as well as all the other teams in the West. But if we missed any burning questions for Anaheim, Calgary, or Chicago, let us know in the comments. We'll continue to move through the rest of the West here over the next few weeks to get you all ready to roll for the opening of the NHL season. That is our show today. We appreciate everybody for tuning in each and every day of the week. Make sure to check out the rest of the weekly lineup for Locked On NHL, whether it be at-large NHL coverage or Eastern or Western Conference or power rankings. We've got you covered every Monday through Friday. So make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button too, before you head out here for the day. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.